In about 10 minutes, you know which claims about data centers and water are actually true and which ones are somewhat sensationalist. Data centers are really draining our water supply. Myth or fact? Well, I guess we'll find out. I mean, you should know by now that water has become one of the biggest highlights in conversations about AI and data centers. Over the past few months, I have seen countless headlines, videos, and debates that are making all sorts of claims about how data centers use water. And while some of these concerns are valid, in the spirit of separating fact from misconception, we will address a number of myths that I think are worth busting concerning this issue. So if you haven't seen my previous video that explained the connection between AI, data centers, and water, I'll recommend watching that first and then come back to this one. It will make everything we're about to discuss much easier to follow. And for this episode, we're joined from the Florida Water and Population Control Operators Association for what would be an actual reality about how data centers actually use water. So let's get right into it. In the first myth, data centers are often accused of destroying local water supplies. Here you have people say things like data centers are water guzzlers, draining our towns dry. In reality, yes, data centers use a lot of water, but they are not all the same. I mean, not all data centers operate the same way. A large data center facility can withdraw millions of gallons of water in a day, while there are others that would barely use any. And in the US, data centers use less than 1% of water withdrawals. Of course, impact would vary based on each community and their underlying water challenges, so that means that impact would be very severe in areas that already suffer underlying water challenges, like a particular town in Oregon, which found that Google's data centers took over 21% of its water supply in 2021. So yes, data centers can stress or threaten the community's water, but it always depends on the location involved, the cooling method of the data center in that region, and the water sourcing method of these data centers. What I would also say for sure is that a lot of modern data centers are now mitigating this by using alternative water sources and more efficient cooling, some of which we'll discuss further down. In the second myth, people often assume that water already used by a data center is permanently lost to locals or communities. It's like thinking every gallon of water a data center uses is a gallon less for the community. Now, in reality, that is not exactly the case because not all water that is withdrawn is consumed. On average, 20 to 30% of the water that data centers use for cooling is often returned as wastewater. They are not immediately drinkable, but they are still in the water cycle. Then the remaining 70% portion is what evaporates and is truly consumed and gone and removed entirely from local supply. Also, some data centers use non-potable water sources, which is reclaimed wastewater or seawater. So it means that they are not exactly tampering with communities' drinking water reserve. So in reality, a data center's impact on community water can range from high to minimal. It can be high if it is withdrawing potable water and it is evaporating most of it, and it can be minimal if it is using recycled water or returning most water after cooling. In the third myth, there's an assumption that data centers' water use is just one way. That's like all that water just vanishes. In reality, that is not how cooling works. That is not how it works. Actually, much water does evaporate in truth, but some water does return and can be reused. For instance, in a closed-loop cooling system, water is recirculated multiple times, which significantly reduces net usage. Even in evaporative systems, leftover water after evaporation, we call them blood and water, they are sent to wastewater treatment and can then re-enter circulation for other uses. But note, it must be after treatment. This is something we're going to touch on further down. So think of it this way. If a data center withdraws 100 million gallons of water in a year, about 30% is discharged. That means there will be 30 million gallons of water that is going back into the water system to be cleaned. While it is not entirely gone, it doesn't mean that it is immediately drinkable either. But the point is that not all the water that data center withdraw is being used. About 70% of them, of course, disappears and vapors into thin air, while about 30% is recirculated. In the fourth myth, we have assumptions of if a data center uses water, that means local residents will have way less water to drink. In reality, that is not entirely true because source and management are very important and usually considered before water is being used. Now, it might interest you to know that many data centers, especially newer ones, are striving to avoid using community drinking water for cooling. What they do is tap into alternative water sources. For instance, they use sewage water that is not exactly fit for drinking, or they use some brackish groundwater that is not exactly used for homes. This means that data centers' thirst for water does not always directly compete with the public's use of water, right? Even when potable water is used, it is often used in places where supply is more than enough. But however, communities are also still requiring data centers to offset or replenish water. This is why companies like Google and Microsoft have pledged to replenish more water than they consume, which of course is effectively aimed at giving back water to local environment. I'm going to do a future video on this to show you guys how some of these communities have been fulfilling these pledges. So in essence, presence of more data centers doesn't inherently mean less drinking water. It basically comes down to how responsibly the facility is designed and integrated into local water plans. In the fifth myth, there are assumptions that data centers waste water through inefficient systems like old school cooling towers and the likes. Okay, now in reality, full disclosure, this used to be mostly true, but it is fast changing, I'll tell you. It is correct that most large data centers today use evaporative cooling, which is like a decades old method, but the trend is moving towards some more water efficient tech. We have examples like closed loop cooling, which basically cuts water loss by 70%. We also have direct liquid cooling at the server level, which drastically lowers the need for evaporation. We also have free air cooling in cooler climates, and we have some facilities using recycled water instead of fresh water. And I'll tell you, some of these big cloud operators are very much innovating in this regard. Microsoft is raising server room temperatures so you can use zero water cooling in many regions. There's also Google that is already using non-potable water at a quarter of its sites and plans to replenish about 120% of the water it uses. Then there's also Amazon that is retrofitting dozens of data centers to use reclaimed water by 2030. So in a nutshell, the industry knows that water is a critical issue and they're very much deploying newer cooling designs to use less water per unit of computing. I'll tell you for sure that the days of crazy water use are numbered, and this is driven by both environmental and business pressures. In the sixth and final myth is the assumption that water usage is the only water issue with data centers, as so many people seem to fixate on just water usage alone. And in reality, I will tell you that water quality and wastewater are more like the elephant in the room as well. While everyone seems to be fixated on how many gallons of water data centers are using, only few people get to talk about what is in the water and where it goes. Now, let's backtrack a bit. Data centers that use water for cooling often produce a lot of wastewater. This wastewater would mostly always contain treatment chemicals like biocides and anti-corrosion agents. And these wastewater are also very much concentrated minerals at a very high degree, and they could also contain heavy metals that is picked up from the system. Now, if this discharged water is not managed properly, it can pollute local waterways and overburden sewage treatment plants. There are cases where spikes in discharge from a data center has strained a community's water treatment capacity, and it did raise concern about water quality for the community downstream. This is why some communities have now required data centers to pre-treat their wastewater on site, essentially by installing mini water treatment facilities before releasing it. If you're not familiar, I will tell you that monitoring water quality in real time is now emerging as a priority so that any contaminants or parameter spikes are caught early. So basically, focusing only on how much water is used is half the point. Making sure that the water that is being returned is safely managed is probably even more important for protecting community water resources. I am saying all of this in case you care, not for the sensationalist merchants. I hope you enjoyed watching that. So as you can see, there are atoms of truth in the myth, but also there are some important realities that gives a more balanced picture. So yes, data centers can consume water and of course impact local supplies, but as you have in the video, there are many facilities that are working to minimize that by using recycled water and efficient cooling. And no, data center water usage is not always in direct competition, or it's not purely zero-sum against the water that residents have to use, as long as it is managed wisely, of course. Maybe most importantly, as we have highlighted in this illustration, is that the quality of water leaving the data centers deserve just as much attention as the quantity of water that is coming in. I hope this helps your understanding of the subject. That is, if you really care about it. And let me know what your thoughts are if you have anything contrary or in line with what we've just discussed. See you in the next one.